So as most of you are aware, Alan is an expert in nutrition. He has over 25 years of experience as an evidence-based educator. He's a practitioner and he's also a researcher. And most of you probably come across his work either in journals, articles, books, or in his research review. There are quite a few research reviews available these days, but I believe, Alan, yours was the first of its kind.
You betcha.
Yeah, and it bridges the gap between nutrition science and practice, which is why I approached Alan a couple of years ago now to contribute towards advanced personal training, my textbook, and I'm really glad he agreed to do that because if any of you have read it, Alan's chapter on nutrition in the book is a really good one. Many of you will have read Alan's latest book, which is on flexible dieting. And like with the chapter he wrote for me, he uses scientific evidence to demonstrate that more of a flexible approach to dieting can lead to better outcomes, such as adherence, compared to kind of more stringent diets. As with the nutrition chapter Alan wrote for me, his book's completely supported with scientific evidence. And one topic we've discussed previously, Alan, in these webinars is that evidence-based has become quite a buzzword in the fitness industry, which can be misused. So I see that you recognize this, and in your new book, you also include some really nice content on sourcing and reading research, and something that's really important, which is spotting kind of pseudoscience that's out there. So I'm sure if any of you joining us haven't got Alan's book yet, I'd really recommend investing in that. It's well worth it. So I've got a few more people on the call now, Alan. So what we'll do, if it's okay, I'll flip through to the questions that I've received before the webinar. Now, for people joining us that have not been to one of these webinars before, I've already received some questions through email and on Instagram. But if you do have a question, type it into the chat nice and early, and we will hopefully get this answered towards the end of the webinar. So without further ado, we'll go on to the first questions. And what I've done is categorize the questions into different themes that they've come in. So the first one is always a popular one, and that's on protein. So this question comes from Chris. And Chris asks, I've heard a lot of different advice regarding protein timing when you're training for muscle hypertrophy. Does it matter when you consume protein?
Okay, well, everything matters. Everything matters, but the degree to which it matters varies. In the beginning, with protein, there's a hierarchy of importance where total daily amount is by far and away the most important aspect of protein intake. And a distant second is the timing and distribution through the day and relative to the training bout. So that's really the important thing to keep in mind. You're looking at the cake, which is total daily amount, and then the icing on the cake, or some might even would say the sprinkles on the icing, being the distribution and timing relative to the training bout. So if you're consuming your total daily protein intake over the course of at least three meals, then it'll make very little difference what the timing is and what the dosing scheme is of your intake. I wrote a paper with Brad Schoenfeld recently where we took a look at what individual protein doses maximize the acute anabolic response as measured by muscle protein synthesis. And we just chose the higher outlying doses. And it turns out that if you want to achieve the so-called golden range of total daily protein intake, which is 1.6 all the way to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, then you can consume that over at least 3 to 4 protein doses in the day. We nitpicked it at least 4 protein doses, dosed at 0.4 to 0.55, or I just round it to 0.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. And this is per protein dose. So 4 doses at 0.4 to 0.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, taken 4 times throughout the course of the day. And then that will net you 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight as far as total daily protein intake goes. And that is really, that's the most that we know today as regarding what would maximize muscle growth. Whether you have this stuff immediately post-exercise or at some sort of delay up to 2 hours, it doesn't seem to matter. We meta-analyzed the literature on the anabolic window, and it turns out that as long as your daily protein intake is sound, then the shuffling relative to the training bout within these 2 hour margins pre and post, it really doesn't seem to affect protein intake. But I will say this, there's no reason to specifically delay protein intake post exercise because it's an opportunity to feed, and you really should take all the opportunities you can to consume the nutrients that you need when you are trying to actively maximize rates of muscle gain. So hopefully
that's
makes
really
sense.
interesting and really practical advice. You touched upon the anabolic window there, and I think that became a concept probably about a decade ago, didn't it? It was quite popular, and you see people sort of really chugging on protein shakes in the gym as soon as they finish. But what we're basically saying there, if you get 4 protein feedings across the day, you know, that's going to take care of your overall intake, and sort of that really chugging protein as soon as you leave the gym, whilst it's not that sort of important, you can do it if you want.
That's right. So conversely, if all you did was consume your protein in, let's say, 1 or 2 meals throughout the course of the day, you might not be maximizing the potential for muscle growth. And this is just theoretical, but in the theoretical sense, if you can maximize the number of times that you top out or maximize muscle protein synthesis, then theoretically that over time, over weeks and months, would result in more muscle growth, as opposed to having 2 maximal MPS spikes in the day, 1 or 2, then you have 4. Well, then theoretically you would do better with the 4 maximal MPS spikes than the 2.
And this can be one where people sort of get lost in the weeds, so to speak, can't they? I've listened to Stu Phillips speak quite a few conferences, and one thing that he always really emphasizes is that the main anabolic stimulus is through the training itself. So sometimes, you know, people get a bit too worried about their protein timing. Maybe they should focus more on the training, and as you've just said, just some practical distribution of protein across the day, and that's those boxes ticked.
I have a bit of an issue with Stu's emphasis on exercise coupled with a de-emphasis on protein intake. Because if you want to genuinely maximize muscle growth, and there's a lot on the line, and you're at a high level and the stakes are high, you don't want to undershoot protein. It's much more beneficial to slightly overshoot protein than it is to undershoot protein even a little bit. So
to give yourself some room
bit,
for error, basically.
Yeah, I take a bit of an issue of Stu's downplaying of the contribution of optimizing protein intake to the muscle growth process. So, and I think that's fine if you want to take that gamble as a casual trainee or somebody who doesn't necessarily have pressing goals to push the envelope with muscle gain. But if indeed you're trying to, if your primary goal is muscle growth, then you are basically shooting yourself in the foot if you're doing the training right, but you're somewhat neglecting or undershooting protein.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I would agree with Stu that the training effect is larger than the protein effect, but they both have an effect, and you don't want to shortchange yourself on either one of them.
Yeah, so cover all bases, but yeah, don't get too neurotic on the kind of exactly when you eat your protein, as long as you spread it out throughout the day. So the next protein question that I've come across was from Jefferson. He says, for people dieting in low-income countries, what are good strategies to achieve your protein targets?
An easy way to go is protein powder in bulk. You can get whey protein from almost anywhere in these big dog food size bags. Whey protein is less expensive than casein or blends, or it's less expensive than plant protein blends that are trying to mimic whey anyway. And so you can get those dog food size bags of whey, and you should be fine. It's convenient as well. There's always things you can try to accumulate in bulk, like eggs, dairy, anything, eggs, dairy, protein powder. Of course, it's going to be more expensive to try to get animal flesh in there if the economic situation is not optimized for that. But yeah, you can always depend on just big bags of whey. That would be my default.
Cool. Excellent. Again, like really nice, practical and simple advice. So this one follows on from the protein theme, and this is specifically on hypertrophy. So it's a bit of a longer question. He provides a bit of a detail, and this one's for anonymous. So I'm training to increase muscle mass, but I'm a bit confused about how much to increase my total calorie intake by, if at all. I've been training for around 5 years and gained around 2 kilos, which I think is mostly muscle. My maintenance calories are around 2,800. I've been advised to increase my caloric intake by 10%. What would you advise?
The margin that you should experiment with, trial and error wise, if you're not a novice trainee, is roughly 10 to 20% above and beyond what you know maintains you. So that would be the margin that you would experiment. With some people, going above 20%, imposing a caloric surplus above 20% is necessary, because they find that even when you try to impose a caloric surplus, then they have this spontaneous increase in non-exercise activity. So these are more hyperkinetic people who are more prone to fidgeting and more prone to just generating caloric expenditure through various pathways of movement that has nothing to do with their training. And sometimes this happens at a subconscious level, just as the body's response to try to preserve the status quo, or just try to preserve homeostasis. Some people naturally ramp up their non-exercise activity when you try to impose a surplus on them. Therefore, some people actually do need to go above the 20% surplus target. And the only way to know is trial and error.
And how long would you recommend that trial period goes on for? So for this person, if they increase by 10%, how long should they continue with that 10% before maybe upping it to 20 or 15%?
A month. So 4 weeks is a reasonable time period for almost anything, for almost any sort of trial, to see how a diet is working, whether it be in the direction of weight gain or the direction of weight loss. And the month-long time frame to test out a protocol is particularly important with women because of the menstrual cycle. So they would want to be able to compare two identical time points relative to the menstrual cycle, which can mess with body water weight flux. And so yeah, I would give it 4 weeks to see whether it's in quotes working.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, that on the sex differences, because with that question, it was from, I don't know if it was male or female, and that's something that isn't usually captured within nuances, when you see sort of 10% guidelines put around. And I think a lot of the times as well with these types of questions about increasing or decreasing caloric intake, is that sometimes people don't appreciate the dynamic nature of energy balance, like you just mentioned. So although you're increasing by 10%, that might not be a true increase in 10%, because you might get compensatory responses whereby your kind of body isn't then using that towards anabolic processes. You're just kind of burning it off. So that's a really interesting and useful consideration for people, is that they take into account sex, but also I guess training status as well. Would that come into play?
Training status would definitely come into play when you compare the research done on resistance trained subjects or just exercise trained subjects in general versus untrained people, novices, beginners, straight off of the couch. The trained folks have less of a margin to use for caloric surplus imposition before they start putting on body fat. So if you take a group of trained subjects closer to their potential for muscle gain, and you put them on a drastic surplus, like 20 to 40%, then they will tend to gain a lot of body fat. On the other hand, you take untrained subjects and you hit them with a 20 to 40% caloric surplus, they will tend to partition that towards the lean department, towards lean tissue. It's a very interesting phenomenon. And so the closer you are to your muscular potential, the more careful you have to be with imposing aggressive caloric surpluses if you want to avoid excess body fat gains.
And is that, I'll go on to the next question in a second. This is just one of mine, but is that something you come across quite frequently, Alan, where people try and maybe force feed muscle gain, where they just think more is better in terms of the surplus and they'll get there quicker?
Yes. It's usually a mistake for more experienced guys, more advanced trainees to be imposing large surpluses. And, it's because when newbies embark on a muscle gain program, they have a lot of room to increase training volume, and they have a lot of room to increase muscle size and strength. And so what happens with them is they end up putting a lot of that incoming energy towards where it needs to go, towards progressive increases in training volume. And of course, their more rapid increases in muscle growth at the beginning stages of their training career, of their training status. Whereas more advanced folks have just significantly less potential than the new guys to funnel or partition this energy towards the lean tissue department.
Cool. Thanks for that. That's, again, really actionable and easy to follow advice. We'll go on to the next.
Let me also mention, Paul,
Sorry.
I want to also mention that the rate of muscle growth is something to keep an eye on. When you're striving to gain muscle, that's your main goal. As a non-newbie, you would be lucky to get a pound a month. You would be lucky. So a half a kilogram a month is pretty spectacular for non-beginners to grow muscle tissue.
So, and thereafter, as you become more trained and older as well, I guess that becomes smaller and smaller, that increment in gains in lean mass.
Oh yeah. 3 to 5 kilos in a year for that would be a spectacular goal for somebody who's not a beginner.
That's actually one thing that quite amuses me with I mentioned before, I work with a lot of endurance athletes, and when you suggest the idea of resistance training, one of the common sort of misconceptions is they're like, oh, I don't want to gain loads of muscle. And it's like, well, if you understood how difficult just people actually trying to gain muscle is very difficult and slow process. So doing a couple of training sessions per week and running, sometimes up to 80 100 miles a week, you're not going to be getting any sort of hypertrophy from that. But that's
a humorous concern.
And it persists. It's still pretty common. It always amazes me like how many times I hear it, but it's probably because kind of we're immersed in the literature and this area, so we kind of take it for granted that maybe other people know that that's a myth. Right. But anyway, we'll look on to move on to some of the more specific dieting questions. And again, what I've done with a few are on a similar theme, so I've kind of grouped them together. And hopefully, if you did send me a question, it will be answered over the next few questions. So Steph asks, I've seen reports that there's no difference in terms of fat loss between traditional dieting and intermittent dieting, where you take diet breaks, provided the overall caloric restriction is the same. But are there any advantages to taking diet breaks?
The advantage of diet breaks is that it gives you a psychological break, a psychological break from the grind of dieting. And so the issue with studying this is that studies really are only feasible to be run for 2 to 3 months at a time. It's very rare that you see any studies really on any topic lasting more than 6 months. And so whenever a 12-month study of anything is done, it's a big deal. Woo, we got a whole year here. But you have to think in terms of the time frame of people's lives. How long are they going to be dieting? How long is this going to last? And usually it's people spend more than 2 to 3 months dieting. And so with diet breaks, it's kind of the difference between let's imagine if there was a pathway, a walkway, and a bridge over the oceans from here to China, for example. It's the difference between jogging all the way to China versus having rest stops along the way to your jog to China. And so the diet breaks would be the rest stops, and it gives you an opportunity to mentally recharge and then get back on and then keep going. And so the main advantage of diet breaks would be the psychological respite from the grind of dieting that would allow you to potentially adhere better in the long term. So even though, mathematically it all works out the same, whether it's linear or non-linear, but the diet breaks will give you a chance to actually, decrease some of that psychological fatigue of dieting.
Would I be right in thinking, I don't know if I've read this somewhere or seen it or heard it in a podcast, but there's diet breaks been shown to help sort of regulate hunger better than linear dieting?
The subjective reports of hunger, desire to eat, they tend to be a little bit better in the nonlinear patterns. So not by some sort of spectacular margin, but yeah, the trends point towards that. Yes.
And just to be clear with everyone, when we talk about diet breaks, you don't mean sort of cheat days, because I mean, these were popular, at least on social media, quite a few years ago, where you'd see people like arguably binging on just whatever they wanted. But I take it that's not what you're referring to when you refer to a diet break.
Yeah, diet break would be a 1 to 2 week period where you pull the reins off of you take your foot off the gas pedal as far as the restriction and being strict to the letter to your diet. So I would call it a unrestricted but non-YOLO period of dieting that lasts 1 to 2 weeks. And you can almost consider it like eating at pre-dieting levels or at former maintenance levels, where you're not sticking strictly to the script with your diet. And
but not going completely off the rails and just kind of, as you say, eating anything you want, and then potentially undoing the good work you've done previously.
That's exactly right.
Cool. Okay, the next one is on a similar topic. This comes from Jonathan. He says, I like the idea of time restricted feeding as it's simple to follow and fits within my lifestyle. Is there a consensus on whether it's better to have the window, and I assume he means your feeding or eating window, earlier or later in the day? For example, is 8 a.m. till 4 p.m. better than 12 till 8 p.m.?
That is the perfect example of trivial. So when effects are that trivial and that minuscule, the best thing to default to is doing what you prefer to do, because you'll stick to that better. You'll have a greater chance of adhering to what you prefer in the long term. So we're not talking about how long you can keep something up for a number of weeks or a few months. We're talking about a lifestyle and a lifetime. And so some people are much more comfortable schedule-wise having later shifted eating, and that's perfectly fine. And that if you read some of the research, you might get scared or intimidated about not front loading your calories or not having your feeding window in the earlier part of the day. But that is counterbalanced by longitudinal research showing that, well, indeed, later shifted eating resulted in greater changes or more favorable changes in body
It,
composition. This was Sofer and colleagues in
is
2011.
that from sort of like the breakfast research that shows that if you people that skip breakfast are more likely to gain weight? So there's a lot of observational research that's been done in that area.
There's some observational research that's showing that, but the bulk of that research, especially when it's when you include the interventional stuff, the skipping breakfast groups actually tend to gain less body weight and maintain greater weight loss. But that all comes down to just calories in versus calories out. If you're skipping breakfast versus someone who's not skipping breakfast, you're just going to be netting a lower amount of calories by the end of the day. And so I think that this whole area of research on placement of the eating window, should it be from 8 to 4? Should it be from 8 to 6? How about 8 to 8? That stuff is so incredibly trivial. And even when you look at the stuff showing benefit, it is, first of all, the effects are very small. Secondly, we don't always see that benefit. And thirdly, it's on sedentary subjects. It's in the absence of a training bout. And so the training bout changes the whole game, and it changes your physiology for the day. And you can even argue that if you're somebody who trains in the afternoon or the early evening, or, even some of the few of you who train later on in the evening, that concentrating all of your calories in the earlier part of the day is not going to be optimally aligning fueling and recovery demands with the training bout. And so, yeah, I am just simply not convinced that we need to tiptoe around specific placement of feeding windows beyond what the individual prefers and can stick to.
That's an interesting point. I guess it comes up within your book quite a lot, is the importance of individualization and context, because I think I went to it was a chrono nutrition type conference a few years ago, and there were some studies that emerged about those associations between people that eat later in the day and body weight. But one of the confounding factors that they mentioned is that in observational research, if you eat fairly late in the day, it's important to distinguish what that is. I mean, usually people aren't sat in front of the TV eating rice and broccoli and chicken. They're, your highly palatable, energy dense foods. So that's probably a consideration as well, isn't it? It's not kind of just when you're eating, but what are you eating in those windows?
Yeah. There's levels of optimality we have to consider. So if person A finds it easier to stop eating at 4 p.m. or 5 p.m., let's say he's doing the early time restricted feeding, which is essentially, shoving dinner towards the later part of the afternoon, or skipping dinner. Okay, if that's what helps this person prevent mindless eating through the later parts of the evening, okay, great. That's fine for him. Now you take another person who has goals of optimizing their muscle mass and reducing body fat. What this person is going to do is they're going to make sure their protein distribution is idealized. So they may be eating 3 or 4 protein-rich meals that span 12 hours through the day. Who knows? Maybe even more, where they're having a hit of protein first thing in the morning. They're having a couple of hits of protein throughout the middle part of the day, and then they're having a hit of protein pre-bed, or not necessarily pre-bed right next to your bed, where you got your protein shake sitting next to your bed. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about eating a hit of protein within 1 or 2 hours of sleeping. And it doesn't have to be a big, huge pile of meat before bed, or a tremendous amount of protein, but what you're doing is you're optimizing protein distribution to optimize muscle protein synthesis. And when people are in, let's say, a hypocaloric state, then they would depend on the anabolic response of their meals to optimize muscle retention while in hypocaloric or dieting conditions.
That's a good point, because I've worked with clients in the past that one of the problems when they've gone on a diet is they often found themselves waking up hungry. So I actually, what we implemented in a few cases was kind of going against this idea of not eating late, and actually, as you just mentioned, having a protein-based snack before they went to bed. And that usually worked quite well. And it's, again, a case of sort of like context coming into play. If we just have like an arbitrary rule of, you shouldn't eat late at night or before you go to bed, then that kind of one strokes approach doesn't really work for everyone, does it?
No, and it doesn't, because once again, you're talking about levels of optimality. If somebody wants to recomp, this particularly, they want to gain muscle, lose fat, which is entirely possible, then that's not going to happen optimally if you're cutting off your intake at 4 or 5 p.m. and you have this tremendous opportunity to feed protein for the final 6 or 8 hours of the time that you're awake. And this is an opportunity to activate muscle building and muscle retention machinery within the body. And it just makes no sense to utilize a program that's meant to default people from mindless eating late at night when you're somebody who is aware of your entire program and is aware of what you're consuming throughout the course of the day. So at best, the early time restricted feeding model is potentially a good beginning strategy for people who struggle with mindless late night eating, and they kind of need something that corners them and handcuffs them down into not overeating during that particular period of the day. But for physically active people in training, in an exercise training program, it just doesn't make sense to cut off eating at a certain time, specific time of day, because once again, we have to look at the hierarchy of importance. Far and away, the most important factor that's going to determine body composition and health, including all of the battery of clinical parameters of health, is going to be what are you consuming by the end of the day in total. What is your food selection like? What is your macronutrition like? What's your micronutrition like by the end of the day? That is of utmost importance, and that is the cake. So the little sprinkles on the icing, honestly, if that, is when exactly during the day you're going to position that intake. And people who are physically active, people who are training, it makes no sense to cut off intake at a certain part of the day or to delay intake to a certain part of the day, because it's just so trivial that the best thing to do is default to your personal preference of when you want to have that feeding window, because your personal preference is going to dictate long-term adherence over years and decades.
For sure, that makes perfect
personal
sense.
preference will your preference is often going to be dictated by the constraints of your schedule socially, and a lot of that stuff. Like, people can have the best intentions to try to follow a certain time restricted feeding regime, but then it starts degrading their quality of life from the social angle, and that's part of health too. And
you've read my mind, because that was the question I was going to ask you there. Is
okay.
Often this is not from the audience, it's just something that I was thinking there as you were speaking, is that often, like, these guidelines or advices and diets, they don't, particularly on social media, they don't really the conversations don't consider sort of lifestyle and cultural elements of diet. And one of the things, for instance, if I was to recommend all of my clients that come and see me to do sort of this intermittent energy restriction, but they've got a family and their family has meals at certain times, then it can present problems. And one thing that a few years ago I did a study on low carbohydrate diet for some cyclists, and they got on well with it fine. But then one thing we did was exit interviews, which often isn't done in research, and they had good outcomes. They all lost body fat on this low carb diet, but one of the themes was that it did interfere with their social life a little bit. Like, if they were one of them were going to their kid's birthday and they felt like they couldn't really enjoy it, and the other liked to drink at the weekend. So I think that type of thing, maybe sometimes when we just look at research and have arguments on social media, we don't necessarily always consider those factors.
Yeah, very true. There's the theory that we're looking at when we're worrying about our first world problems, which the timing of the feeding window is a first world problem. But we've also got first world goals too. We want to look kind of jacked, we want to look a little better than average. So yeah, that stuff definitely comes into play. And I would say that people have a lot of flexibility regarding how to position their intake, whether it's earlier in the day or later in the day. And ultimately that it just matters so incredibly little in the very big picture. So
yeah, I mean, me personally, I would find it easier to have a later window, because I've done it before, and when you stop eating at 4 o'clock, feels like a very long time after that. Particularly if you see other people eating as well.
And that reminds me of another point I wanted to make. When we look at the aging population, so older adults and the elderly, one of the last things you want to do is eliminate their opportunities to feed, particularly protein. There's an issue with older adults getting enough protein to protect against age-related muscle loss, so sarcopenia, and age-related strength loss, dynapenia. And so when you tell an elderly person, hey, I just read about this cool early time restricted feeding thing where in sedentary adults who are potentially pre-diabetic, it can improve glycemic control over this 24-hour study. So stop eating after 5 p.m. You are doing them a severe disservice, because with the elderly population, you're going to want to take advantage of every opportunity you can to get proper nutrition, particularly protein. So that's something I just wanted to throw
that's
in.
Another really spot on important consideration for the elderly who maybe got a lower anabolic response to arbitrarily kind of introduce a window. Like, it could actually have a counterproductive effect. So that's a really good point.
Yes.
Okay, sticking with the intermittent fasting theme, this question's from Navid. He's trying intermittent fasting to lose body fat. I reduce my calorie intake to 800 calories 2 days a week and eat at maintenance, which is around 2,500 calories on the other 5 days. Would you recommend eating below maintenance calories on the 5 days to accelerate fat loss?
You can. Sure. Just be mindful of your total rate of weight loss per week. So if you're losing more than 1% of your body weight per week, then there will be a tendency to be losing too much lean mass alongside of your fat mass. And the leaner you get, so this really isn't necessarily, fast weight loss isn't necessarily an issue in individuals with obesity. However, as you march down towards normal weight and certainly towards leanness, then you stand a greater chance of losing lean mass with rapid weight loss. So just be mindful that you're not crossing over roughly 1% loss of your body weight per week. Then feel free to increase your deficit on those, in quotes, non-deficit days of your 5-2 plan.
Cool. Interesting. So similar concept to the other question where the person was trying to gain weight. Basically, if you keep an eye on your body weight changes and kind of individualize from that, you can't sort of fast forward or accelerate muscle gain or fat loss. Or the more aggressive you go, it could be counterproductive. Is that right?
That's right. That's
Cool.
right.
Excellent. Thanks for
We
that.
want high quality weight loss. So high quality weight loss means fat loss with as much preservation of lean mass as we can.
Yeah, I suppose that's one of the I think we touched upon that in one of the chapters in my book, in the personal training book, is that becoming overly focused on weight instead of body composition. And it was a common thing that myself and Mike Matthews, who co-authored that chapter, is that people become quite excited when they see large drops in weight, but that's not necessarily a good thing. And particularly if you're fairly lean, if you're seeing that, then you're probably losing some fat-free mass as well as lean mass.
Yep, that's right.
Next theme is carbohydrates. So this one often causes a lot of controversy and debates. So Tom asks, I'm trying to build muscle whilst keeping my body fat in check. To do this, I'm following a low carb approach, eating around 100 grams of carbs a day. I'm 80 kilos and train 3 to 4 times a week. Do you think 100 grams of carbs a day is enough to fuel my strength training sessions?
Probably. There's a wide range of carb intakes that work for muscle hypertrophy. And unfortunately, we don't have the experimental data to even begin to look at what the effective thresholds are. But what we do know is that if you're taking in ketogenic levels of carbohydrate, which would be roughly 50 grams per day or less, then what we see consistently in trainees on ketogenic diet levels is that they have a tough time putting on lean mass. And it often defaults to losses in lean mass compared to the control group who has a conventional high carb intake. And this would presumably be through a couple of different mechanisms, one being just the fueling capacity, the glycogen, resting glycogen levels that would constitute just size of them and mass of the muscle at rest. And then also the fueling capacity of glycogen, low glycogen muscles versus glycogen replete muscles. So it just makes sense from those two basic standpoints that running low carbs is a highly inefficient way to try to gain muscle. And that's why ketogenic diets repeatedly have been shown to be not good at muscle gain. So you're talking about 100 grams of carbohydrate. My gut feeling on that is you could maybe scrape by. You can limp by if you're not necessarily a large person and you don't necessarily have grandiose goals of muscle gain. However, if you're a larger individual and you have goals of pushing the envelope and putting on some substantial amounts of muscle mass over time, over the next like few years, you're going to struggle with even that level of carbohydrate restriction. And so keep this in mind. This is an interesting bit of data. Andrew Chappell and his colleagues looked at the amount of carbohydrate that elite level, like national and up level, natural bodybuilding competitors who place in the top 5, how much carbs do they consume during the contest prep period? And it ranges from 4 to 5 grams per kilogram of body weight. That's their carb intake during the contest prep period. It dips down to about 4.
That's a lot higher than most people would assume, right?
It's a lot higher than most people would assume. And it's right around the 300, 350-ish gram mark. So when you look at the best of the best in natural bodybuilding during contest prep, and they're consuming 300 grams of carbs, and you're telling me that you want to limit your carbohydrate intake to 100 grams. Well, as Jim Rohn said, success leaves clues. And we look at the best of the best who are getting the best possible results, and you're undercutting yourself by about a third of what they're consuming. Then you have to sort of weigh the risks with the benefits, and maybe open your mind to the idea that carbs are not the things that are going to get you fat during the surplus.
For sure. And
You
this
know,
is,
because
I won't go down a rabbit hole here, but I had did a Q&A with your old friend Gary Taubes a while ago, and it was kind of one of the points I was making to him when I said that I think we're discussing different populations, because like you've just said there, when we look at people who are basically professionals in losing body fat, if the carbohydrate insulin model was correct and was reducing carbohydrates was the best way to get lean, then as you say there, we would expect the best of the best to be doing that approach. But without going on a tangent, I was kind of making a point to Gary, is I think when we're looking at that research on low carbohydrate diets, the population, I think, is critical, what we're looking at in terms of training status and what they're doing. And you kind of touched upon that point there, that even people that are achieving kind of freakishly low levels of body fat are still consuming carbohydrates.
Yes. And this individual who's asking the question, he's talking about a caloric surplus. So if you're going to be restricting carbohydrate in a caloric surplus, you're either going to have to make up that surplus somehow with protein or fat. And there's only so much protein that you can consume in a surplus before you start impinging upon your body's ability to stand that surplus. And so if you think about the overfeeding studies where they use either fat or carbohydrate to impose the surplus, the carbohydrate surpluses are much less lipogenic or prone to cause fat gain than the fat-based surpluses. So we have to consider that research as well.
Yeah, from often in sort of keto discussions, you'll see people, and I've had this, people come for resting metabolic rate tests, and they're kind of really loading up on the fat as you do in a keto diet, and they've been told, okay, well, if you eat a lot of fat, and I've had, the usual things like butter in coffee, creaming, loads of cream, coconut oil, etc. But the point that I often make to them is, okay, yes, you're burning a lot of fat, but that's because you're eating a lot of fat. So the body's going to oxidize it. So it doesn't, I think that's probably where a lot of the confusion comes in. People equate oxidation or burning of fat with losing body fat. And then, yeah, the penny drops when they realize, it's not as simple as that.
Absolutely. The so-called becoming a fat burning machine. You're not necessarily burning the fat from your love handles. You're burning the fat from that stick of butter that's coursing through your digestive tract.
Yeah. Again, it's one of those sort of like things that you think intuitively that seems obvious, but then it's not necessarily, because if it's sold in a certain way, ketogenic, it does. I can see why people would think that way, that restricting carbs to bare minimum and then just loading up on fat. Oh, my fat burning's increasing. But yeah, it's still energy that's coming into your system that the body's got to use or store.
Yes. And then there's an increase in intramuscular triglyceride with high fat diets. So you're oxidizing more intramuscular fat. And it's not necessarily, once again, it's not necessarily an increased oxidation of fat from the places that you want to lose it on your body.
Yeah, that's how actually the conversation came about with Gary, is because I mentioned to him sort of offline that I actually worked with a few clients that were on a ketogenic diet, pretty strict as well. They were recording, and I was saying, if this hypothesis is true, the carbohydrate insulin model, I don't know how it was possible for a few of them to gain body fat, because quite a few did. And that's because they were overfeeding fat. But maybe that's a conversation for another day.
Yes.
We'll go on to Michaela's question. She asked me quite a long one, so I've shortened it.
Okay.
She says, how do you suggest reintroducing carbohydrates after being on a low carb and high protein diet for weight loss? And I'm hoping to avoid regaining weight. For example, the diet calls for low carb intake, trying to stay under 30 grams of net carbs per day, and high protein is roughly 130 grams of protein a day for me.
Mm.
Should there be an adjustment with protein intake when introducing more carbohydrates?
Just be aware of total caloric intake. Be aware of that. As long as you don't include carbohydrates at the cost of keeping your total caloric target in check, then you'll be perfectly fine. Another thing to pay attention to in addition to total caloric intake, is make sure the type of carbs that you reintroduce are satiating. So things like fruit, yeah, it's sugar, but guess what? It's satiating. It's a low energy density, high nutrient density carbohydrate. And I'm not talking about fruit juice. I'm talking about whole fresh fruit. Other options would include things like oats, things like potatoes, tubers, legumes. All of those things are high satiety, high nutrition carbohydrates that are going to be a bit more optimal for this sort of reintroduction phase.
And does this question stem from sort of the reverse dieting concept, I suppose? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that reverse dieting is fine. I mean, it's one of the approaches that is emerging, and we don't have any research data. We don't have any controlled data on it. But essentially, what reverse diet, the way that reverse dieting works is through an increase in what's called energy flux. So energy flux is your state of caloric intake and state of caloric output. So somebody who is bedridden and has a low energy expenditure as a result of being bedridden, and they're consuming a low calorie amount, this person has a low energy flux. So reverse dieting, what it does is it raises the energy flux. So in other words, higher caloric intake corresponds with higher caloric output. So those things run in tandem. So when people are, in quotes, reverse dieting, they're gradually increasing their caloric intake, but they're also using that incoming energy to expend more energy during exercise and maybe even outside of exercise as well. So increased energy flux has to happen in order for reverse dieting to be successful. And it often does happen. So that's the deal with reverse dieting.
So if you don't do that, so if you just increase calories quite aggressively, would you say that you're more likely to sort of overshoot body fat than
Oh, yeah.
you would if you were sort of to titrate it?
Yes. Yes. If that increase in caloric intake doesn't come with concerted efforts in trying to improve training performance and or increase training volume, you're just going to pile on some fat. So,
and would it be right in thinking, I might have got this wrong, but is the mechanism that after being on a sort of hypocaloric diet for a period of time, the fat cells become almost more primed to increase in size or potentially increase in number? Is that one of the theories behind that sort of gaining a large amount of body fat after dieting?
it's a theory. It's usually going to be the size of the fat cell, not necessarily the number, although there's some interesting research showing that occurring in the lower body. Limited research showing that. But it has a bit more to do with appetite levels at the post-dieting state, at the dieted down state. Then your responses to feeding are going to be much more intense in terms of the hunger hormones, or your responses to deprivation as well. So higher hormone levels that regulate appetite, anything from ghrelin and NPY on the hunger side, and then things like CCK and PYY on the satiety side could tend to be lower in the post-dieted state. So you've got to be mindful of that.
I suppose the other consideration as well that I've come across is when people are coming off a diet is not going back to their pre-diet maintenance level, because if they've lost an appreciable amount of body mass, then their new maintenance is going to be lower. So they need to take that into consideration as well.
Yeah, it's a treacherous game. You got to
For
be
sure.
careful.
Yeah. Alan, we're coming up to the hour, but is it, had quite a few questions come in live. Are you all right to take a couple of those if that's all right?
Sure. Yeah,
Just 'cause
I don't have a strict hour cutoff, so I'm happy to stay a little bit.
Okay, cool. Nice one. Yeah, I always like to get to questions that people have stayed patiently on the line.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Back to a protein theme. Do excess intake of protein cause some gut issues and bowel disruption?
This is a highly individual thing. You'll find that for some people it does. And for a lot of people, it doesn't. And usually when changes in the diet are made gradually enough, then the body can adjust. So there's really no universal answer to that, because individuals vary so much in their response to changes in the diet.
Cool. This one's coming from a student, so I'll ask this one. For context, I completed my BSc in Sport and Exercise Science in 2014. So this is an undergraduate student or former undergraduate student. I still work full time, but the last 2 years he's done some courses in CrossFit and he wants to get back into the health and fitness industry. What suggestions would you have for building or starting a nutrition coaching service?
There are there's a number of organizations that assist aspiring professionals in that area. Of course, the hardcore thing to do would be to get a nutrition degree and march your way through some dietetics curriculum if you have another 4 to 6 years to spare. But
And some money as well.
and some money, right? But there are some nutrition coaching certifications that are worthwhile. And the existing ones that are good, off the top of my head, we've got Precision Nutrition. We've got the National Academy of Sports Nutrition's nutrition coaching specialization. So there's certification. That's a good one. Martin McDonald, a buddy of mine from way back, he's got a good certification as well. But things like Precision Nutrition and the Mac Nutrition Uni, those are like almost a year-long commitment, 6 months, a year long. Something a little bit less of a commitment would be the NASM nutrition coaching specialty. And I even think ISSA has something similar to that as well. So you can take a look at those. Now, there are a couple of organizations that I have to mention too, but these commitments are a little more like 2-year, and the cost is in the thousands, like towards the 3,000-ish. And there's an organization by Laurent Bannock. It's called the IOPN, and that's a big certification that would potentially take 1 or 2 years to complete, but it would be well worth it. And another biggie in that similar tier, which would be kind of the top tier for the certifications, is the Sports Oracle diploma in sports nutrition. So that's put out by the IOC, the International Olympic Committee. If I'm getting that acronym right, but it is Sports Oracle
right, yeah.
who puts out the diploma in sports nutrition. So if you want to go top tier, IOPN or Sports Oracle. If you're kind of in that area of sports nutrition and working with that population, which is a good way to go, because if you wanted to go into clinical nutrition, you really would need to go the dietitian route, where you get your butt back into the college classrooms and sit your way through years of the curriculum.
Yeah, I like the way you've answered that with recommendations for further study and education, because I think there's can be a bit of a tendency for people to kind of skip over that stuff now and kind of want to go straight into working with people and giving advice. But if you haven't got that underpinning foundation knowledge, then like you met one of the examples you mentioned earlier about, say, working with the elderly population, your advice could be quite counterproductive and dangerous. And on that theme, actually, this question that's just come in is quite relevant. This is Andrea. She's curious on your thoughts and special considerations on dieting with osteopenia and hypothalamic amenorrhea.
Okay. So dieting as in trying to lose weight, like hypocaloric type of dieting?
I assume so. It's not in the question, but I
Okay.
guess that's what she means.
Okay. So essentially, maybe three things come to mind immediately. Number one, you're not going to want to diet aggressively. So try to keep your caloric deficit. And this is kind of this 10 to 20% metric. It applies to both sides of the calorie equation. So try to limit the caloric deficit to 10 to 20% of maintenance calories per day. And then that way you won't be necessarily putting your lean mass at risk for being lost during the fat loss process. Make sure your protein is in check, as well as your micronutrition, specifically with the bone building minerals. And so keeping protein in check, once again, I wouldn't go lower than 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, which is 0.7 grams per pound. And with completing micronutrition, there's ways to do that dietarily, and there's ways to fill in the gaps supplementation wise. And so with that department, you know, I'm tempted to just say, get this person working with a qualified dietitian, a registered dietitian, because they're going to need to look at those clinical parameters that characterize the disease. Whereas trying to get it done on your own, you may be missing a few things. So maybe I would default to keeping those things in mind, which I mentioned.
Yeah.
And then go see a professional.
Cool. Sound advice. Just one final quick one. This is probably won't take you long to answer. If BCAAs have been proven not to enhance muscle growth if adequate protein is consumed, then why do bodybuilders why are they still hung up on these supplements?
A couple of things. The bodybuilding population, they are driven by going the extra mile. They're driven by taking that extra step that might give them the competitive edge beyond what the regular folks are doing. And given that mindset, they're very susceptible to the marketing of products that are purported to do these things. So for maybe at least 20 years in the marketing materials for supplements, branched chain amino acids have been pushed out to the public and to this population. And with enough classical conditioning, it just gets embedded in their minds, especially since BCAAs do have a scientific basis for how they work. So yes, leucine is the key anabolic driving amino acid. And yes, the branched chain amino acids are the key anabolic driving amino acids amongst the essential amino acids. And yes, that's all true. But a lot of people are unaware. The people who do buy branched chain amino acid supplementation, they're not aware of the research comparing sufficient protein with leucine piled on top of it, showing no difference in muscle gains. And B, they're also just generally unaware that high quality proteins contain anywhere from, on the low end, like 15-18% BCAA, to the high end, which would be about 26% BCAA in the protein matrix already. And so the analogy there would be taking BCAAs on top of a pre-existent sufficiency of total daily protein is the equivalent of turning the sprinklers on during a rainstorm. So it's superfluous. So a lot of people don't know that.
it's one of those things that, again, when we look at research objectively, we say that's pointless, but then sometimes, if it has maybe a placebo effect, then people are willing to pay that.
Yeah, and the placebo effect will contribute to the effectiveness of the protocol too. So yeah, I mean, if people can come to grips with the fact that they're kidding themselves into something that agent is working, when the reality is it's a psychogenic benefit, then they're okay, as long as they're aware of that, and they're not fully getting ripped off.
For sure. Yeah. Thanks, Alan. I think I've consumed enough of your time. Just like to say thanks to everyone for attending, and your really great question. We've still got a few to get through, but maybe
I can take one more. Let's get one more in.
Okay, let's do
for
one
the
more.
People in the West Coast. It's only 11:10 over here. 11.
Okay,
11,
well,
11,
I'll
so
give you the choice on this one then. Do you want one about perimenopause or another protein question?
I would dive into the protein question. or you know what? How tough is the perimenopause one?
I think it might be quite a long-winded answer.
Is it long-winded?
Yeah, I think so. It's about perimenopausal women, or women going through the menopause. How should they eat or train differently?
Yeah. Okay. That one's not very complicated.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. There are environmental forces during perimenopause that make it difficult for women to not gain body fat, because there's vectors that downshift physical activity levels, and there's social vectors that upshift superfluous eating, drinking, boxed wine. I mean, we're talking about various forces from above and below that stress the individual out and remove them from a fitness focus. So a lot of it is environmental. It's not necessarily physiological and metabolic shifts that will doom perimenopausal women to, for example, gaining body fat in the abdominal region. They just have to pay attention to maintaining the training and the dietary levels that they had in earlier adulthood. So there's nothing particularly magical about the perimenopausal period that would predispose women to putting on more body fat, although there is some data showing that the distribution of body fat accumulation can shift towards the abdominal area due to hormonal changes. Yes, I'll grant you that. However, it still can be decreased, and it still can be minimized if a priority is put on the program. It's just that during that time period in people's lives in middle age, usually they're parents with kids in school or not. They're taking care of kids. They're taking care of aging parents. It's environmental pressures that take the focus off, that facilitate mindless eating, and that downshift their physical activity levels. So just pay attention to those things, and you can get the fire back of youth.
Okay, cool. That's that's encouraging. I get, would the same apply to men as well, who experience that midlife increase in fat mass, usually around like the abdomen?
Yeah, it definitely applies. And for the perimenopausal women, I would say that a lot of them are unaware of the benefits of progressive resistance training during that time. They usually just kind of jump on to start walking more and just treadmill more and stuff. And that stuff is all fine and all beneficial, but see what happens when you progressively resistance train, as well as keeping the diet in check during that time. You'll see some pretty miraculous stuff happens. And same thing with men.
So I guess you're not I've seen quite a few sort of supplements in recent years sort of being marketed at women going sort of pre or going through the menopause. What are your thoughts on those? Is there anything in the sort of scientific research that backs any of that up?
No compelling data, none that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I didn't think there would be, but I just thought, yeah, if there's anything on the horizon that's coming. But like with most supplements, there's very few things that have shown strong evidence to work that have been rigorously tested. Yeah, we won't go into supplements. I'll finish off with this one because it's quite a funny one. It's May Wan, and she says, "Not a question, but Alan, that's an awesome T-shirt." And she's put a little emoji there.
Thank you.
So
yes,
yeah, we'll leave you with that compliment, and just for me to say thanks very much for answering everyone's questions and giving up your time. Really appreciate it. And as I said to everyone at the start, if you haven't already, I do recommend having a look at Alan's latest book, because yeah, having done some work with Alan and seen how methodical he is with his writing and research, yeah, I think there's probably not that many books which have had this much research to underpin them. So congratulations on that, Alan, and thanks very much for joining us today.
I really appreciate it, Paul. And for those of you who are unaware, Paul's last name is pronounced Huff, like
Correct.
tough. I've been in my mind, I've been constantly calling you Paul Ho. So
yeah, the worst one. I had that on a couple of times on. I've done some TV stuff in the past, and you kind of, your family sit down to watch it, and then they introduce you, and they're like, "Here's Paul Ho," and you're like, "Oh no, that's not a good start." But yeah, I'm used to it. So thanks for getting it right. Appreciate that.
Thank you everyone for tuning in, and yeah, everybody have a great rest of your day or rest of the evening.
Cool. Thanks very much, Alan. Speak soon. Bye.
All right, take care.